Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, CEO of SpyderWorks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Jason Finucan, founder of StigmaZero, a workplace mental health training company. Jason is also the author of Jason 1 StigmaZero, my battle with mental illness at home and in the workplace. Like this video if you enjoy our show and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Jason Finucan, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. And I appreciate you saying my last name correctly. It is not the
Oh, it's one of the big parts of being a podcaster, isn't it? So Jason, what we're going to be talking about today is actually very personal to you. And we can start with, the fact that you wrote a book, Jason 1 StigmaZero, My Battle with Mental Illness at Home and in the Workplace. And the book is part memoir about your own mental health journey. So just tell us about this journey and how, maybe going back to the beginnings of, how you realized that you had this struggle and what your first thoughts were, out of the gate.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, I'm actually going to go back a little further because there was my experience with mental illness is very much connected to my experience with physical illness. And that for me began when I was a very young boy. I was 8 years old, and I began experiencing the symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as a nerve defect in my heart called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. And the reason I'm bringing this up, I know we're talking about mental health, but the reason I bring it up is because I learned an incredibly important lesson that I rely on now. And I feel that it actually helped me to deeply understand stigma and mental illness and the problem with the way we respond to it in our society. And it's simply this: I had an illness that every single person in my entire sphere of influence understood and immediately empathized with. Zero stigma was attached. No one stigmatizes a little boy with a bad heart, period. And
Right.
so I was rallied around. I still have this huge collection of letters and cards and notes and wonderful things I received from all of my classmates and my teachers. I mean, I could not have been supported more fully by everyone in my life. And I knew that that was a very privileged place to be when I went through it. But of course, I didn't take it for granted, but I wasn't surprised either, because it makes sense. It makes sense that you're treated that way. Thankfully, the surgery that I had was successful. It fixed the nerve defect in my heart. And from 12 years old, when I had the surgery, until I was in my mid 20s, I enjoyed the kind of health we all take for granted, the kind of health where the worst thing that happens to you is a flu or a cold or COVID.
Right.
and you just kind of assume that you're going to be fine. And frankly, I'll be honest, I consciously thought I've already had my big health scare of my life. I just had it early. And I thought I was going to cruise along until I was an old man. But unfortunately, in my mid 20s, I began experiencing the symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. And the way it started for me was with clinical depression at a very low grade level. It was kind of like I later diagnosed it or quantified it as mild clinical depression. But the problem is if you don't know what mild clinical depression feels like, and I did not, it feels like a flu. It feels like, in my case, I felt a sudden lack of energy. I felt a sudden heaviness, doing everything in life, from getting up and showering and going to work, having a conversation with somebody, everything just got a little harder, but not insurmountable. So I didn't really, frankly, think of it as a mental illness. I just thought, maybe I've got a virus. I don't know. And I soldiered on right through it and continued. And it lasted about 2.5 months, and then it lifted completely. And so I didn't think about it. But then it came back a few months later, and it was a little worse. And it kind of went like that for a while. I, at the time, was not at all attentive to it or tracking it or thinking of it in any big way. But what ended up happening was, of course, it got worse and worse. And the moment that it occurred to my fiance at the time, I might be dealing with clinical depression, and she said that to me, I became part of the problem that I now have dedicated the rest of my life to solving, which is as it turns out, didn't even know it. I had an enormous amount of stigma towards mental illness.
Right.
And I applied it all to myself. So I refused completely, flatly. There's no way I have a mental illness, because my mother had suffered very severely from clinical depression, unipolar clinical depression, and my dad did not. So I grew up simply thinking mom doesn't try hard and dad does. Mom struggles, dad doesn't. It was such a simple, naive way to think, but we all, many of us have fallen into that trap. And so when you think that way, you think, well, I know that I'm someone who tries hard, works hard, overcomes obstacles, so this is something I can overcome. And of course, that was the absolute worst way to think, because my illness untreated just got worse and worse and
Right.
worse. And it ended up being that I was finally, after 2 years of ever worsening episodes, where instead of 2 months of mild clinical depression, I was having 2 months of severe clinical depression, where I almost was a non-functioning human. I couldn't work. I couldn't be social. This conversation we're having, I would have had to cancel. I just wasn't able to function. I did not have the energy, mental or physical. So even I eventually realized maybe this is a medical problem rather than something I can just overcome and bootstrap. And unfortunately, because I was experiencing mostly depression, not very much in the way of the hypomania, and I had not yet been manic, so they couldn't diagnose me as bipolar. They treated what they saw. They treated the depression. And back in 2003, when this was happening, they did not know that certain antidepressants are the wrong medication to give to somebody who has bipolar disorder. And what happened was they treated the depression beautifully. I came out of the depression and I went into hypomania, went back into depression. They increased the dosage, and I immediately went into a manic episode in February of 2005. And a manic episode is a crisis point. I mean, you are in a very, very bad state of mind, because I didn't sleep for 6 consecutive days because I had so much energy coursing through me that I couldn't stop. I didn't stop talking, writing, moving. I just kept going. And as you do this, you start to lose your touch with reality, because, I mean, any human being who doesn't sleep for 6 days, it's not going to be in great shape on day 5. But if this is driven by a manic episode, it's much, much worse. And my family ended up needing to intervene. I started to lose all sense that anything was wrong with me, and I was forcibly committed. I literally had to be taken to a hospital against my will, and my family signed a form, and I was put into a psychiatric institution for 3 weeks, quite literally unable to leave. I did not have the right to leave. And that was a very difficult thing to go through, of course. But while I was there, I was finally diagnosed correctly. I had bipolar 1 disorder. I was in a manic episode because of it. I needed to be removed from those medications and put on a very different medication. In my case, it's lithium, is a mood stabilizer. And that was February of 2005 when I was released. And by June, we'd reached the therapeutic level of lithium for me, which is different for everybody, and you have to kind of slowly approach it. And when I got there in June 2005, for the first time in almost 3 full years, I woke up and I felt like me. I felt zero impact of my illness. I wasn't down. I wasn't up. I was just me. And I remember thinking it in those terms, like, oh my God, I actually feel like myself again. And it really hit me that moment was the last, I would say, the last nail in the coffin of my stigma towards mental illness. Because after 3 years of trying harder than I have ever tried at anything in my life and failing utterly, I never once succeeded to manage my illness without this medication. And then I took a little bit more of this medication from the previous week, and the symptoms stopped. That is clearly a biochemical relationship in your brain.
Right.
And I finally just realized, I was like, this is ridiculous. Why am I behaving differently about this illness than I was about my heart defect? And this is why I started with the heart defect. It was an incredibly important perspective, and it allowed me to ask that question. What would I have done differently if my heart defect had come back instead of this new illness? And the answer is, I would have had zero stigma towards it. I would have immediately sought medical attention. I would have immediately tried to find solutions, and I probably wouldn't have gone through 2.5 years of hell. That was when I became, frankly, right at that moment, I became a mental health advocate. I realized I had a perspective that I could share, that I could help others to realize. And my hope was for everyone out there who faces mental illness, whether it's directly or indirectly, I wanted my story to accelerate their experience from onset to where I got to 2.5 years later, which was, this is an illness. It's no different than any other part of your body that's failing. You have to treat it like an illness, like a medical challenge, and approach it in that same way. And if you do that, you radically increase your chances of successfully finding treatment.
Well, Jason, thanks for sharing that. And as I listen, there's a couple of things that I really think stood out for me just at the get-go. One, the support you had from your family.
Yes.
And support in the sense of, and for yourself in the sense that it started out with you feeling like you were having a bad day or a bad week, which I think makes it, I'm not a doctor, but I mean, as a person, I think that just makes it that much harder to come to terms with or to understand it could be wrong, because we all have bad days. We all have bad weeks. And making the leap from that to, no, I think there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
Like medically wrong with me, or biomedically wrong with me. That must be, well, as you said, it was tough, it was challenging, you had to be committed, but that must be very hard for the average individual, because when my osteoarthritis acts up, I know it's acting up. It's really simple.
Yeah.
You didn't go through that.
No, you're absolutely right. That is the singular most challenging aspect of mental illness when it arises. Even if you don't have stigma, it's not easy to ascertain. That's 100% true.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not suggesting that my 2.5 years would have been 2.5 weeks had I not had stigma, but I guarantee it would have been a lot less time, because basically the way that I came to realize how we should think about our health is I use a very vivid and a little gross analogy, but I trust me, it'll work in your mind. And it's this: how many times would you allow yourself to wake up on a regular morning and suddenly feel a wave of nausea? You go and you vomit and you come back and you feel better, and you're like, well, that was weird. Why did that happen? Maybe I have a flu. Maybe I have food poisoning. Fine, that's one day. How many days in a row will you let that happen before you see a doctor? I have yet to meet a person who gets past 7 days. And frankly, every person who gets past 3 days is female, because they're tougher than we are. I mean, flatly. But the truth is, we all would say to ourselves, something is clearly wrong. A different thing is happening to me, and it's repeating itself. And so that's really what it comes down to. Is I say to people, when they say, how do I know the difference between I'm maybe unhappy in my life versus I might be medically ill? And I always come back to, we have to become aware of our state of mind and our mental health in a way that is somewhat abstract, that is that you can have an objective opinion on. So I track various parameters of my health, and I started doing this only after I was diagnosed, and as a way to manage my illness. But I recommend to anyone who doesn't feel like their health is perfect, why not? It's easy. I use an app called eMoods, and there's a million apps out there that you can track your health. And all I track is my sleep. How many hours of sleep am I getting a night? And therefore, is it changing from the average in a dramatic way, up or down?
Mm-hmm.
How many days do I say that I feel just bad, like low energy or lethargic or fluish or any of those things? You can categorize it how you want. But essentially, what you're looking for is a pattern. Are you away from your baseline? And whatever your baseline is. So your baseline might be you get 4 hours of sleep a night and that's all you need. And your baseline might be you need 9 hours of sleep a night.
Mm-hmm.
That part doesn't matter. All you need to know is what is your normal. And once you know that, you can see the deviations from your normal. And if you can't attribute it to a very clear trigger in your life, so maybe you're a little down, you're a little sad, you're a little frustrated, or you're a little anxious, but it's very clearly tied to things in your life. Well, nobody recovers from a death in the family, or from a loss of a job, or from major things that happens in our life. We don't recover from that in days, but we should recover from it in weeks, right? And
Right.
so that's how you can start to really tease out the difference between regular life is hard versus something might be wrong with me. And it does take time. It genuinely, for a person who's never experienced an anxiety disorder, for example, who suddenly starts experiencing anxiety, might take them, even an actively non-stigmatized person who's paying attention, might take you a few months to figure out, oh, this is actually, I have data now that shows this is happening way more than it ever used to. That now warrants a conversation with a doctor.
Now, you're talking though about baseline and understanding your baseline. It seems to me that, look, your story is about first your heart, then mental illness, and we'll talk about your book. But it seems to me that regardless of what you might be challenged by, the notion of finding your baseline, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, emotional, that's a great place to start and to understand, especially as some of us might be getting a little bit older. And there might be some signals or signs that we should be picking up about ourselves. And again, physical, mental, whatever the parameters are.
I agree. And I think the real difference is, and that's why I always keep comparing the physical to mental illness and how we respond as an individual and as a society, is that, like that example I gave with the daily nausea, was basically, if something significant changes, it doesn't have to be dramatic, it doesn't have to be severe. It just has to be marked and noticeable. That could be an injury. Like, I'm a golfer, and when I golf, normally my elbows don't hurt. But one year, my right elbow started to hurt, and quite obviously. And I was like, okay, that's different. I should probably go see, an osteo or something and find out, do I have an injury to my elbow? Turned out I did. I had golfer's elbow. But I didn't wait. I didn't suffer through the pain for months and months and months and months before I sought attention. And the reason is because we accept those situations much faster because they present themselves very clearly, and we're willing to recognize them because there's no stigma, there's no shame. I didn't feel bad about myself that my elbow was hurting. So that's where I say to people, if you're concerned about your mental health even a little bit, even if you just feel like your mental fitness is a little off, the first thing I always say is start tracking all of these parameters as best you can. It quite literally takes me 2 minutes a day. That's all it is. I open my app and I go boom, 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 boom. These are the answers to all the questions. And now I have data points, and I can look back at months and years of data and say, okay, look at that. I suddenly started sleeping an hour less a night. That for me would be a terrifying data point, because that would mean maybe I'm leaning towards hypomania again. So, for example, that, knowing me. But if you've never been diagnosed with something, establishing what is your normal and finding out how far away from your normal you are is a wonderful starting point to assess your health and to know if you need to do anything about it.
Right. Well, especially when, look, this is a research study of one, but when you go to the doctor, it's how do you feel different than you did before? Have you experienced it before? So I think the more you know or understand is great. So we pick up the book, we start reading the book. What are we going to learn? Or is this only a book for people with mental illness or potentially with mental illness? Or is it for everybody to learn and understand and appreciate the struggles or the journeys, I guess I should say, of others?
I love that question. Thank you for asking that. I very carefully and very intentionally wrote the book for absolutely everybody. And the reason I did that, and the reason I say that, is quite simply, if we're honest, everyone listening to this podcast right now, if we're honest and answer the question, how many degrees of separation are there between yourself and anyone with any degree of a mental health challenge or illness? And the answer is generally 0, 1, or 2. Nobody gets beyond 2, because we all know someone who has had some form of a challenge to their mental health. So to not actively learn about this is doing yourself a disservice. It really is something that, if you can learn about this, even if you've never experienced anything close to a mental illness, and even if no one in your immediate sphere has experienced that, if you read a book like this, you will learn how to respond should that occur. And a big part of what I'm trying to offer, as I mentioned before, is prevention and preparation. So my hope is you never experience a mental illness. My hope is no one who you love experiences a mental illness. But wouldn't it be good if that were to happen, if you had a sense of, oh, this is what's happening and this is how I should respond? Or perhaps the person, let's say it's your daughter, is experiencing suddenly a major anxiety, but she's doing what I did and self-stigmatizing. If
Right.
you've read my book, you'll recognize that and you'll know how to talk to her, how to get through to her. And that's not to say it's going to be easy, but you will have a really clear starting point about what works, what doesn't, and also what is the mindset of a person when they're in that state.
Mm-hmm.
So the response I get to my book often is either from a person who's experienced mental illness or mental health challenges directly. They'll say things like, I now have a much clearer idea how to manage my own illness and how to handle the people in my life who treat me poorly as a result of their stigma towards my illness.
Right.
Great. I love it. That helps them. And I'm so happy about it. But the other people I help are the people who've never had a mental illness, but someone in their life has, and they just didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to respond. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know what not to say. And by the time they read my book, they have one man's example and all that I've learned. Because as I say, the book is part memoir and part how to. And that's how I wrote it. So I use my story more as a vehicle to help break down the barriers of understanding, to help people just to really, oh, that's what it's like when a person is feeling that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it looks like. That's what it sounds like. And so that's the main reason I share such detail in my story, is just to shine light on these things. And then the rest of the book is, here's what I did wrong. Here's what the people around me did wrong. And here's what it looks like if we do it right. And here's what you need to say and do differently in order to produce the right kind of response. So I get a lot of people saying they read my book and they're very appreciative of it, and then they've passed it on to someone in their life who they know, wow, they need this. They could benefit from this. And nothing makes me happier than to hear that. I wrote the book not with an eye on generating a whole bunch of sales. I wrote the book with an eye on, I want to take the knowledge that's in me, put it in a very easy transmissible device to give it to as many people as possible. And that's why I also made it into an audiobook, because I happen to be somebody who really prefers to listen to my books rather than physically read them anymore. And so I wanted people who felt that way to have easy access to the same content.
Well, especially for those of us who have long commutes in big cities.
Yes, exactly.
Audiobooks serve a lot of different purposes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jason, this, I don't want to say it's been translated into a company. Maybe the company came first, and you can correct me there. But StigmaZero, workplace mental health training company. That is your company.
Yes.
Going in and helping, I guess, companies overcome the stigma, to understand the signs. What do you do? How do you access the company? How do you make people understand? As you're saying, now it's not just people in your family or your friend group, but at work, it's tough because there's that obvious caring for your colleagues, but there's obviously the other part of being at work, which is, hey, we've got to get this job done.
Yeah.
So how do you approach that?
It's a great question. And I would like to just go back a little just so that our listeners know this was a very long iterative process. I didn't come out of the experience of having a mental illness and learning about stigma and immediately think I'm going to help people in the workplace. What I did was I started out as a mental health advocate for, I live in Montreal. There's an organization here in Montreal called AMI Quebec, and they're not for profit. They do wonderful work with education outreach. And I went to them and said, listen, I think I could help. And they said, absolutely, we'd love you to be part of our education outreach. And I started delivering basically keynotes on the back end of their education seminars. And those were to universities, to high schools, and to companies. And so I began learning how to do what I'm doing with you now, which is explain my story in a way that is useful to the person listening. And
Right.
I did that from 2006 all the way to 2015. I did probably 50 volunteer talks to thousands and thousands of people. And I was able to develop my message and really learn what was working. And what I found was the people coming up to me after my talks were in equal measure people who were currently in crisis with their own mental health and realizing it more because of what I just told them, or people who knew someone who was and were desperate to help that person. And those were my two basic constituents that I was realizing I can really help these people. And it was my wife who actually said to me one day, you need to stop doing what you're doing, which was professional fundraising, and you need to do this for a living. This is really what you should be doing. And so in 2015, I decided to, found a company, started StigmaZero, and essentially tried to take what I had learned, what I developed, and turn it into a training program and an inspirational keynote. And that's how it started. I had a 2-hour long workshop and I had a 1 hour long inspirational keynote. And I started selling those to companies as a way to begin this process of training on mental health. And I, of course, developed that over time. And now I have many more live workshops, many different options for keynotes. But then in 2018, we connected with the Montreal Jewish General Hospital. They were our first really large client, and they loved what we were doing. They had me in for a keynote, they had me in for a workshop, and then they said, we want you to train our entire hospital, but you can't do that live. That's not possible. It's just, we are not going to get that many people into a room over time. It'll take 5 years. So they said to me, if you build an online program with your content, with you delivering it, we'll buy it. And with that knowledge, and frankly, with that assurance, we took the risk and we went and we spent a full year actually, working with a consultancy, an expert on education technology and e-learning. And we built an online program that now we can onboard a company of 100,000 employees in a week, because it is now something that you can subscribe to. So that's how we do it. We actually offer a suite of services now, from direct consulting that I can offer to a company that perhaps has a really difficult situation that they're trying to work through and they need advice. I can do reviews of existing policies and procedures for employers relating to mental health and how to respond. And there's the individual in-person or virtual now, often workshops, keynotes, and then finally there's the online program. And so we really have this suite of training options that employers can use. And I do want to say, I like using the word employer, not company, because I believe any employer, you could be a school, you could be a not-for-profit, you could be a large corporation, you could be a government, doesn't matter. If you are an employer of people who you pay to come to work and work for you, you have a workplace culture that is either good, bad, or indifferent when it comes to mental health. And what we can do at StigmaZero is assess your workplace culture and help you, if it needs it, and frankly most do, help you move towards a stigma-free culture when it comes to mental illness, so that you can better respond when it happens. Because we all know, especially after the last few years, we all know that mental health challenges are widespread. They're frankly affecting every single employer on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm thinking about the last few years, and not to take this to a negative place, but as we go into a potential or almost assured recession, I mean, we're coming out of a challenging time where we've been alone to a time where we're going to be facing some incredible challenges, financially and on the work front. And
Yep.
it's going to be a bit of a challenge.
For sure. And throw in the war in Ukraine, to go from a pandemic that threw us all completely for a loop, and then we're trying to figure out how to live through that. And of course, there's people who've lost people to COVID, and there's an enormous amount of stress involved there. And then almost immediately on the heels of that, a brand new, very significant war happens that is extremely unsettling to everyone and concerning. And then, as you say, inflation and recession. So it just felt like the last 4 years have been a lot of hits coming at us. And for people whose mental health was perhaps already strained, that really created a problem. In the workplace, it really comes down to one simple thing. Illness of any type is an ongoing challenge for any employer. Your people are people. Some of them are going to get sick. Some of them are going to need to take leaves of absence because of medical problems. That could be because of cancer, that could be because of injury, it could be for all kinds of reasons. The main issue is we have systems, very clear systems, on how to respond to physical illnesses and injuries, but we don't have, most companies do not, most employers do not have good systems when it comes to how to respond to a mental illness. And so my goal ultimately, and why my company is called StigmaZero, is because we are trying to get to the point where the stigma towards mental illness is reduced to zero, to the point where two people working for the same organization, let's take a man and a woman. You have a woman who is diagnosed with breast cancer. You have a man who goes through what I did, all of a sudden experiences depression, doesn't know what the hell it is, doesn't know what to do, is figuring it out. The difference in the two experiences today is vast. The goal is there should be no difference in the experience. Each person should quickly recognize that they have an illness. They should quickly be comfortable in seeking medical attention for that illness, and they should have zero fear about reprisals, judgment, stigma, career impairment because they disclose that illness. Find me one person, man with prostate cancer, woman with breast cancer, who's afraid to disclose that information to their work. I don't know anybody.
Right.
In fact, they all quite comfortably disclose it because it's important information to tell their employer that, look, I'm going to be going through chemotherapy. I might need to have a different work setup for the next little while. And frankly, that's usually done quite simply. People put their heads together, they figure it out, and they do it. But if a person has a mental illness that they think, and even in a little part of their brain thinks, I have control over this, this is about my character, this is about my work ethic, you'll never talk to your employer about that. Or if you're afraid of their response or them thinking that. And the goal is to get to the point where all illness is treated the same. Because the name mental illness is, quite frankly, I use it, I have to, it's the term, but it's a mistake. Humans made a mistake when they called these illnesses mental illnesses rather than brain illnesses, because they are quite simply a failure in the biochemistry of the brain. And part of my course, actually, my online program, talks about comparing PET scans of healthy brains, bipolar, OCD, depressed, and anxiety brains, and they're completely different. They're functioning on a biochemical level in a completely different way. And so once we start to realize that illness is illness, health is health, it doesn't matter what part it's coming from and where it is, we can streamline our response in a way that is incredibly effective. And it will reduce the negative impacts of these illnesses to the workplace, to the employer.
It seems like there's a secondary benefit that might even be as powerful as the primary. I mean, the development of emotional intelligence and empathy within a workplace, because yes, you're talking about mental illness or brain illness, but you're really talking about learning to empathize with what other people are going through. And that can be a team member, it can be a potential customer, and looking at a market. So, I mean, I think there's some fundamental skills that in today's world are so powerful that can come out of this.
I really agree with you there. And one of the things, when we went from me delivering individual, in-person workplace sessions, and then we developed the online program, it allowed us to really dive into the curriculum and figure out what was needed, how can we make what I'm doing much better, much broader, much deeper. And one of the things we discovered very early on was I was touching on the topics of emotional intelligence and empathy, but I wasn't actually teaching people emotional intelligence, and not directly.
Mm-hmm.
That is a significant part of our online program. And the reason is, you will never eliminate the stigma of mental illness, just like you will never eliminate racism or sexism in the workplace without the development of emotional intelligence and empathy. So I actually invert that. I don't think that emotional intelligence and empathy is a byproduct of this process. It's in fact something that must be an early stage part of this process. If you want to get to this end, you must develop emotional intelligence and empathy. So we do that quite a bit in our program, and we supply resources that allow people to do it further with other organizations and other systems. But It is true. A person who does not and has never experienced a mental illness, so does not have a clear understanding about it, the only way that they could possibly understand it is first to use their emotional intelligence and then to use their empathy. And if those two skills are weak, that's a problem, and that person may not be able to do it. So as a manager, for example, if one of your team members, again, reports that they have cancer, very few people need to use their emotional intelligence to understand the concept of a person having cancer. It's just been, we all have learned it as we grew up. So you learn, oh, this person's sick. It's not their fault. It's something that happened to them. But then you learn that a person has clinical depression. If you don't have that empathy, if you don't have that emotional intelligence, very easy for you to say, well, I've never experienced depression. And if I did, I was able to get through it. So why should this person get any special treatment? That's
Right.
that's the trap that people fall through, and that's one of the major traps that we educate people and give them the tools and the skills needed to avoid.
So, Jason, boy, it's been a wonderful talk, and it's gone so quickly because our time is coming
No, it does fly.
to an end this morning. But I do have one last question for you. I mean, we're both sitting here in Canada, and I'm wondering, I guess, where Canada lies on, that spectrum of embracing mental illness and breaking down stigma. And two, are there countries in the world that really do it better, if not well, maybe well, but at least better, or are starting to break through?
That's a great question. When I began my mental health advocacy in 2006, I liken it to, I felt a lot of the time like I was standing alone on a soapbox in the middle of a field and nobody was there. Like I was talking about something that almost nobody was paying attention to. And that, because it was in Canada, it was pre Bell Let's Talk. It was pre any major campaign by the Canadian Mental Health Association. And so from then until now, I can absolutely say there has been an enormous amount of development and momentum in the right direction. Many more organizations exist that are trying to do what StigmaZero is doing, which is educate and create awareness and provide training and tools. Way more organizations exist now to provide support, and way more employers understand that part of their responsibility as an employer is to provide an, like, not just an employee assistance program that covers you if you throw your back out, but an employee assistance program that covers you on all elements of health, including mental health. So the good news is we have done more in the last 10 years than we did in the previous 30. I can say that confidently and happily, and I'm very, very pleased to see that. How far we have to go from now to the point of true ending of the stigma, true treating of everybody the same, we still have, frankly, a long way to go. And it's similar to the problems of racism, of sexism, of other societal prejudicial problems that we have. They take a long time. They take a lot of re-emphasis and re-education and so on. The countries that I see that are doing very well, Australia is one that I would say is at or above what Canada is doing. New Zealand is another very, very strong one. Some of the countries in Europe are really advancing in this process. I know that Great Britain has done a lot of really great work, have a lot of really good programs, and the U.S. is coming. It's becoming much more of a very topical, awareness of the leaders of companies. So here's a simple anecdotal way I can put it. In my first couple of years, reaching out to companies, meeting with VPs of HR or CEOs or anybody like that, I got a lot of questions like, this sounds nice, but why would I do it? What's the ROI? That's a fair question to ask. And in fact, I've actually contributed to the answer by co-authoring a white paper on the ROI of ending the stigma in the workplace. And there is a massive ROI. But I'm thrilled to say that more and more and more, when I meet with somebody who's a prospective client for our services, they're not even really asking that question. They're saying, we already know we need to provide tools and training about this. We're just looking for who is available, and we're comparing the options. That is a significant shift. That is a shift of people realizing this is not a nice to have. This is something that every employer must do if you want, frankly, to retain top talent, attract upcoming talent, because your generation and my generation, we might have put up with this, but Generation Z, no chance. They will not work for you if you don't provide these kinds of base level services and supports. And so I think if you're an employer and you're not currently offering something in the way of training regarding mental health and mental illness, you're going to find yourself behind the eight ball, and it's important to do that. I am more optimistic now than I've ever been about our ability to get to a place where the kinds of experiences that I had going through a mental illness in the workplace are going to become an outlier. We're heading in that direction, and I'm more optimistic than I've ever been that we'll get there. So that is very, very exciting to be able to say that.
Well, Jason, thank you for that. Thank you for what you do. And above all, thank you for your time with us, sharing this morning, and look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Thank you, Ken. It's really been my pleasure. I love the work you're doing with Say Hi to the Future. I think it's important to just put a spotlight on many of these things, because it gives people the opportunity to learn about topics that really apply to all of us.
Thank you.